Hello, my young detectives. Imagine a story about millionaires that has all the ingredients of a rich and eccentric life. A giant mansion in the jungle, waterfalls, exotic animals and gemstones, firearms, angry locals and outsiders, military guards, kidnappings, corruption, and to top it all off, a corpse in a bedroom, glittering with 500 Tiffany lamps. It sounds like a plot from a cheap novel written by an aged novelist, doesn't it? But this story is real, and it happened in 2010 in one of the smallest countries in Central America. John Bender, a brilliant 44-year-old American financier, was known on Wall Street as a restless genius. In 2000, after earning nearly $1 billion, Bender left his career on the stock exchange and retreated to a residential complex he personally designed and built in the jungles of Costa Rica. But the carefully constructed paradise soon turned into hell. John Bender died on the night of January 8, 2010 in his bed in a bedroom surrounded by a sea of stained glass lamps. The cause of his death was a single gunshot to the back of the head. The only witness to the shooting was John's 38-year-old wife, Anne. Together, they created a paradise in the impenetrable tropical forest. They supported each other in the joint struggle against manic depression. Together, they slowly but surely went crazy due to the risky combination of extreme isolation, mental health issues, and conflicts with enemies, both real and imagined. The couple suffered from a mental state that colored their bright life in the tropical paradise into a gray, cold drizzle. Obsessed with their unfounded pain, they closed themselves off from the world, filled each other's madness, and thought a lot about illness and death. John and Anne shared an unusual phenomenon, shared psychosis. Both had risk factors and a predisposition to this condition, as well as the circumstances, absolute social isolation. And it was their madness that led to tragedy. The only silent witness to this drama was the huge Diamante waterfall, furiously plunging its cold waters down the mountain towards the Bender's estate. On the night in question, Anne was found caressing her dead husband's hand and murmuring, "I tried to stop him, but I couldn't." She claimed that John's death was the expected finale for a long history of suicidal tendencies. But the police detectives doubted Anne's story. So, why, despite the obviousness of what happened, did John Bender's death remain a mystery? Let's figure it out, young detectives. John Felix Bender was born in 1966 and was the elder of two sons of Paul and Marjorie Bender. His father, Paul, a renowned legal scholar, held prominent positions in the Department of Justice under the President's administration and at two major law schools, the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Arizona. The gifted Johnny was a chip off the old block. According to his parents, the boy's intellect manifested itself very early. When Marjorie went shopping with the kids, John, who was attending kindergarten, would already mentally calculate the price per ounce of a product whose price was listed per pound and advise his mother on how to save money. The boy's speech was also advanced beyond his years. John started talking early, then suddenly fell silent for a while, only to start speaking in complete sentences. He never did anything until he was absolutely sure he could do it perfectly. He taught himself to read, but didn't show this to his parents until kindergarten. John was simply afraid that if his father and mother found out, they would stop reading to him at night. Bender was a math and science prodigy. At school, he won academic competitions, but couldn't be temperamental and vulnerable, usually because of teachers or students. The young individualist got along well with others as long as they played by his rules. Otherwise, he would get upset and run away. John was a gifted percussionist who didn't become a professional musician because he refused an audition, and an honor student who lost Harvard because he refused an interview. Socializing with people was not one of John's favorite activities. When he was still a teenager, he asked Marjorie, "Mommy, is it okay if I don't have a birthday party?" As a schoolboy, John spent his free time hanging around the physics department at the University of Pennsylvania, where he later enrolled. Student Bender was built like a football player, 6 foot 3 inches tall, 250 pounds. His appearance allowed him to work as a model, and his powerful intellect helped him win local casinos. But Bender was on track for a career in physics, at least until the summer of 1987, which he spent working at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. This was a government-sponsored facility in Northern California where high-tech weapons were developed, as it was the Reagan era and arms build-up time. Pacifist John concluded that most of his career opportunities in physics would be related to developing new ways to kill people, and decided to find something else for himself. John Bender's future was determined the day he visited a friend on the Philadelphia Stock Exchange. He discovered options trading, a numbers game in which he could win or lose solely based on his talents. Almost immediately, he began buying options with his own money. By the age of 22, the young man had succeeded so much that friends provided him with funds to continue his success. Fellow traders didn't know how to act around this shy behemoth. A former trader who knew John described him as a quiet guy with somber facial features who for some reason wore hospital pants instead of a regular suit. And the colleague remembered Bender's striking social anxiety. John was mostly silent, only listening. Soon colleagues appreciated his brilliant abilities, and eventually John confessed to them about the medical pants. "I wore them so everyone would think I am an idiot." He didn't want people to feel stupid or awkward next to a genius and tried to smooth over the situation with inappropriate clothing. The basis of John's success was his understanding of game theory based on strategic decision-making methodology, which in turn is based on predicting the actions of others. Always questioning everything, John discovered anomalies in probability theories that most traders took as gospel. He used his predictive advantage to successfully bet against conventional wisdom. Thus, from 1992 to 1996, Johnson's income was just off the charts. By the time he turned 25, he had accumulated about $80 million. By 30, Bender was running the Amber Arbitrage hedge fund worth $500 million. So the moment when John became a billionaire was only a matter of time. John and Anne met in March 1998 at his estate called Golden Mountain Farm. The 40-hectare property was located in lush countryside west of Charlottesville, Virginia. John had acquired the residence 2 years earlier, telling friends he needed to live somewhere green. He kept dozens of homeless cats on his farm. When people asked why, he replied, "Because they can't talk." Maxine Ann Patton, then 28, suddenly appeared in rural Virginia. She was tiny and very graceful. Her appearance and style seemed more suited to her birthplace, Rio de Janeiro. Anne was one of 2 children born to Kenneth Patton III, head of Chase Manhattan Bank in Rio, and his wife, Gigi. Anne's youth was marked by private schools, parties, and white sand beaches. Then, in the classic manner of a privileged youth, Anne moved from Rio to Lisbon, spent some time in London and New York. She earned a degree from Ithaca College, worked at the College of Fine Arts in Baltimore, and suddenly had an epiphany. She had bipolar disorder. Mood swings had long ruled the girl's existence. By the time Anne turned 22, she was almost always either manic or depressive. And the impulsive move to the States was made during one of those manic depressive episodes. Anne arrived in Virginia, made friends, one of whom suggested the girl meet her ex-boyfriend, John Bender. At their first meeting, he immediately noticed how much her hands were shaking. "Can I get you some water?" John asked solicitously. "Oh no, I'm just on massive doses on lithium," she said. "I have severe bipolar disorder, so if I act strangely, it's because of that." John, just as straightforward, admitted that manic depression had also colored his life, albeit in slightly different tones. His depressions could be as apocalyptic as Anne's, but she never liked the bright side of this condition, while John's mania filled long periods of his inspiration and productivity. He also suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder, so it was no wonder that John eagerly worked 20 hours a day. The first day, Anne and John discovered far too much in common between themselves. Both were children of wealthy parents. They had similar family relationships that could be described as complex. Conflicts in the Patton family were mainly related to Anne's mood swings. The roots of John's conflicts with his parents stemmed from his relationship with his father, who questioned his son's impulsive lifestyle. But their problems did not only bring them together. Bender's massive-featured, broad-faced appearance radiated a calm that others might perceive as detached or even arrogant. But Anne had always been drawn to strong men. John proposed to Anne just 2 weeks after they met. They got married a year later. Despite generational conflicts, the parents of both John and Anne strongly encouraged their children's passion for such things as faraway travels and the wilderness. John told his wife that as soon as he accumulated enough money, he would leave the stock exchange, investing most of his fortune into a larger and higher quality version of the green idyll he enjoyed in Virginia. He shared with his wife that he had been studying places in Costa Rica and Brazil for a potential move. The town of La Florida de Barú sits 670 meters above the Pacific Ocean on the southwestern edge of Costa Rica, perhaps the most undeveloped region of the country. Until 1998, most of the people living there did not have electricity. Residents dwelled in weather-beaten farmhouses or tiny huts, accessible only by narrow dirt roads that turned into mud bogs during the rainy season. No one staked a claim on this corner of Costa Rica. Not even the Americans buying up land in the country wanted it, preferring the northern regions. Living in La Florida de Barú meant submitting to the rule of the tropical forest. The territory was so vast and wild, deadly snakes were in tribes of monkeys. Then, in 1998, 2 of those crazy Yankees appeared and laid out $10 million for 200 hectares of highland jungle. The land consisted of individual farms producing meager coffee crops and a few cattle pastures. The main problem was accessibility, or rather, the lack of it. Thanks to the combination of rocky mountains and impenetrable thickets, this place was cut off from the rest of the world. Perfect, John decided. This is our home. For people with bipolar disorder, mania is the most noticeable symptom, especially if the person has access to resources. Mania often involves grandiose plans, and John, unlike many others, had the means to make his extravagant dreams a reality. He decided to spend about $500 million he had made on Wall Street to build a love nest for him and his wife Anne, and she agreed. Construction took 4 years, and an army of over 500 workers completed the extensive complex, which included 4 separate buildings, a moat, and a helicopter pad. They called it Buracayan, which in Spanish means, well, nothing really. The Benders made up the word because they thought it sounded like the name of an exotic tropical flower. The happy life they hoped for in Buracayan was also something they imagined, carefully planned, and seemed to be gradually becoming a reality. Making a giant 4-story house in the middle of a tropical forest isn't exactly environmentally friendly. but the Benders made the building eco-conscious, plan a new forest to compensate for the damage done to the soil during construction of the house and coffee growing. They positioned their residence first and foremost as a wildlife refuge, the only large-scale private sanctuary in the region of endangered, abandoned or injured animals. The Benders hired a team of armed rangers to keep out poachers who had previously used the land and hunting grounds, and hired 6 full-time animal caretakers and brought in veterinarians when needed. It was a summer camp for monkeys, sloths and birds. Every morning at dawn, the Benders would wake up to the impatient cries in intense stares of macaws hanging upside down from their roof. Creating a nature preserve gave the couple an escape into an extravagant, private universe of exotic flowers, animals and waterfalls. But the main attraction of Boracay was the glittering granite main house located at an altitude of 760 meters above sea level and with an area of 750 square meters. The round mansion looked as if a flying saucer had landed on top of the mountain. It was called the Bender's House or the Big House. The total living area with verandas, sculpture, garden, waterfall, tilapia pool and more was close to 11,000 square meters. Anne and John decided that their home would have no exterior walls. The only thing between the Benders and the elements were curtains that they would draw at night. The household was supposedly inside, cooking, bathing, but always in nature. And everything outside penetrated inside: birds, lizards and insects, wind and fog. Lying in bed in such a house was like sleeping under the stars. The master bedroom occupied the entire top floor. Below, on the 3rd floor, was an office with a large desk, a few chairs and a computer. Despite John's retirement, he couldn't completely withdraw from the game. A satellite dish connected him to the outside world. The Benders liked big things. They bought endless jungles. They drove powerful Hummers through the mountains terrain surrounding their estate. They lived in the shade of Costa Rica's tallest waterfall called Diamante, 180 meters of swirling power. Every day, John and Anne had a ritual. Shortly before sunset, they would go up to the 2nd floor, where there was a kitchen with a chef and a large dining area, as well as a protruding balcony. The couple would go out on the balcony and watch the sunset. Looking left revealed a view of Panama, and to the right you could see Nicaragua. On especially clear nights, when they looked out at the Pacific Ocean, you could even watch whales frolicking in the endless waters. Everything was perfect. And then everything went to hell. The trouble began in late April 2001 on a sleepy country road. John and Anne were in their Ford F-350 on their way to pick up seeds when armed men in an unmarked car forced them to pull over. "John Bender, you're coming with us," the driver yelled. In the ensuing chaos, the militants fired 2 warning shots, one of which sprayed dirt near John's feet, and screamed. The Benders thought it was a kidnapping, but the attackers suddenly identified themselves as plainclothes police and arrested Bender. As it turned out, the whole thing was just to serve John Bender with a curt summons. The lawsuit was related to his work on Wall Street, but John spent 6 hours in police custody before finding this out, and the incident completely rattled the couple. The lawsuit involved a New York financial manager named Joel Silverman, who had invested startup capital in Amber arbitrage in the mid-90s. In 2001, Silverman claimed that John had verbally promised him 25% of the company's value, which by then had surpassed $500 million. Silverman tried to indict John for tax evasion, claiming Bender used offshore tax havens to hide his money from both Silverman and the US government, an allegation that was partially true. John hated the IRS so much that when he and Anne moved to Costa Rica, he renounced his US citizenship. By that time, the Benders had also become unpopular among locals in Costa Rica. Some were hunters tired of being chased by armed men. Others were simply angry they hadn't been hired to work at Boracay. Although the house construction had provided running water, reliable electricity, and dozens of jobs to the area, the project and Benders themselves received a cold welcome. Definitely the locals were asking, who are these rich gringos and who the hell do they think they are? A security expert was blunt, telling the Benders, "My advice to you is get out of here." Spooked, John and Anne did leave, spent 3 months in Canada, but then they returned. This time, not alone. The Benders hired armed guards with military training to protect themselves and their property. But Anne couldn't fully shake her fear and anxiety. The armed detention incident triggered a period of manic depression and physical breakdown. Anne's health deteriorated sharply. She was diagnosed with Lyme disease, and soon after the bandit incident she underwent a hysterectomy. The second crisis materialized one night in 2002 when guards exchanged gunfire with an armed intruder sneaking toward the house. The attempted home invasion only exacerbated the situation. The couple bought even more weapons and turned their sanctuary into a veritable fortress. They lived in fear in a house they didn't even have walls. After a prowler vanished into the night, Anne's life began to fall apart. Her mental and physical condition worsened. A blood clot was discovered near Anne's heart. John was very upset about his wife, and when something was wrong with John, he could snap. He in turn became manic and paranoid. When John wasn't searching for a cure for what ailed Anne, he was beefing up security and buying weapons. At one point, driven by panic, they fled the country again, this time to New Zealand for 3.5 months. But then they returned to Costa Rica. They were in love with this place. This was their home. By 2008, the Benders' lawsuits were settled. They then invested the bulk of their liquid assets, about $90 million, into a Costa Rica-based trust fund. The trust was intended to protect the Benders from future claims on their money and property, including Boracay. Legally, they were now ordinary beneficiaries of a trust run by a local lawyer, Juan de Diaz Alvarez. Alvarez was then John's trusted advisor. Later, Anne would point to him as a key figure in the events surrounding her husband's death. But neither the trust, nor the guards, nor the weapons stopped the couple's descent into depression. Due to their isolation, there were virtually no witnesses to observe the state of their relationship during this period. Most of the information comes from Anne's words. She claimed that John saw a psychiatrist but refused antidepressants. She, on the other hand, was taking a huge number of medications. By the fall of 2009, Anne had practically stopped eating, lost weight, and weakened. The Benders' closest neighbor was Paul Mayer, an American emigre who owned a small wood farm in Los Angeles. Sometimes, in the evenings, driving around the area, Mayer would admire the beautiful view of Boracay. He saw that for the most part of the main house was immersed in darkness, but the top floor of the main building, the master bedroom, was always lit up like a Christmas tree with hundreds of lights. The glow came from Anne's obsession with Tiffany lamps. She craved bright, colorful lighting, and this desire became especially strong during her dark periods, which were becoming more frequent and longer lasting. John would do anything to cheer Anne up. This explained why by 2010 the number of Tiffany lamps in their home had reached 550. Lights of all shapes, colors, and size adorned every floor, table, and the pedestal bed throughout the house. But Anne's health was deteriorating rapidly. Now, in addition to Lyme disease and blood clot, she began to have trouble walking. John sent her to various specialists in San Jose, but nothing helped. John struggled with emotional instability. His devotion to Anne, his desire to help her were so limitless that John saw her problems as his personal failures. He felt responsible for his loved one's illnesses and believed he was letting her down. John convinced himself that he was to blame for everything. He blamed himself for his wife's poor physical condition and even the death of a beloved pet bird. The Benders found themselves trapped in their own paradise. John's life unfolded in a dream home now patrolled by no fewer than 9 armed guards. Bender's personal arsenal included 2 licensed Ruger pistols and 2 illegally acquired AK-47s. The natural beauty that had brought them here now dissolved into irrational despair. John no longer interacted with anyone except Anne. Emails from his worried parents were ignored. Shelter staff didn't see him for weeks. However, there were 1 of 2 occasions when Don John was spotted from afar, carrying Anne from room to room, carefully, as if he were carrying a sick child in his arms. Anne later recounted that John had come up with the crazy idea that the water in that area could cure her. He had even developed his own treatment method. An unknown mixture was injected into Anne daily. According to friends, John had a deep distrust of medicine. After undergoing treatment for a mild aneurysm in 2000, Bender grew to hate doctors and preferred to solve his problems alone. He began experimenting on Anne, giving her different drugs. Of course, it was unhealthy. Anne was experiencing symptoms of hypochondria, exhibiting both genuine physical symptoms and psychosomatic manifestations of illness, driving her to the brink of insanity. John was going insane and successfully trying to help her. Their relationship knew no moderation. They embraced everything to the extreme. At 12:15 a.m. on January 8, 2010, a security guard patrolling the estate grounds heard the sound of a gunshot echoing from the upper floors of the house. Then a woman's voice came over the radio. "Post 5! Help! Help!" The guard radioed his supervisor, Osvaldo Aguilar. After 5 minutes, Anne finally granted Aguilar access to the elevator, allowing him to ascend the 4th floor. Upon reaching the bedroom, the security chief found Anne kneeling beside her deceased husband, his arm covered in blood, as she stroked it gently. Next to her on the floor lay one of John's semi-automatic pistol, Ruger P95. A pillow with a hole from black powder residue lay by Bender's head. Aguilar escorted Anne downstairs to the 2nd floor. There she took a tranquilizer, sat down at her laptop and emailed John's parents. She then called her eldest brother, Ken Patton Firth, at his Michigan home. Anne's first words to him were, "He finally did it." A team of Anne's lawyers and supporters later described the chaotic scene. Police were sending photos from the crime scene to their friends, grabbing anything that wasn't nailed down, and smirking. While the photos to depict quite a few people, the prosecution insisted that everything was handled by the book. By 11 a.m., Anne was an hour's drive away at the police station in the nearby town of San Isidro de El General. There she willingly gave investigators her eyewitness account, then called her psychiatrist in San Jose, Dr. Arturo Lizano. "I need you to hospitalize me," Anne said in almost a whisper. "My husband just shot himself." That evening at the hospital, both Dr. Lizano and Anne's attending physician, Dr. Hugo Villegas, were stunned by Anne's emaciated, pale, and feeble appearance. She weighed about 80 pounds. The blood clot near Anne's heart required the insertion of a permanent stent. Anne's skin was covered in open boils and scars. Most of the sores turned out to be infected track marks from the injections John had been giving her. "They lost their minds together," Dr. Lizano concluded. The doctor believed a tragic accident had occurred. Anne was so physically weak she couldn't have committed murder. She could barely hold a fork. But sick or not, Ann Bender was already suspect number one for investigators. She remained hospitalized for 7 months under Lizano's care and under a growing cloud of suspicion. When Ann was finally discharged, he couldn't return to Boracay, which had now become a ghost house. Police had confiscated nearly all their belongings. It was more like a hurricane or robbery had swept through. Even the 550 Tiffany lamps were gone. In addition, 2 of Anne's lawyers assured her she couldn't be charged due to mental incapacity. But even her legal defenders didn't seem certain of her innocence. Troubled by this, Anne turned to the man who had hired the lawyers on her behalf, Juan Alvarez, John's trusted confidante. Alvarez assured Anne he would take care of everything. He had told her the same thing right up until August 2011, when Anne was arrested and then charged with first-degree murder. Later, Anne would claim the case against her was fabricated by Alvarez himself to cover up the fact that he had siphoned off a significant portion of the Bender's trust fund. With murder charges looming over her, Anne sued the state trustee for fraud. The lawsuit alleged Alvarez used the fund as his personal piggy bank, buying horses for his stud farm and charging personal credit card bills. Then Alvarez disappeared, and a chunk of the Bender's fortune disappeared along with him. Costa Rican authorities supposedly lost track of him, but he is known to be living in Nicaragua like a king today. However, whatever Juan Alvarez did, he did not shoot John Bender, and in 2011 prosecutors saw Anne's lawsuit against him as an attempt to distract them from their firm belief that she did it. Anne was released on bail, but between the date of the indictment and the trial date, a whole 3 years would pass, during which Ann Patton Bender's life would no longer belong to her. The Costa Rican criminal court confiscated her passport, barred her from leaving the country, and mandated weekly check-ins. She settled in San Jose, a city spread out of a plateau in the center of the country at an altitude of 1,200 meters above sea level, surrounded by mountains and valleys. Thanks to the legalization of prostitution, some of these areas look like a Disneyland for middle-aged obsessed Australians. And the city center is a mixture of shopping centers, high-rises and fast food outlets, and separate pockets of appalling poverty from oases of screaming wealth. In one of these high-rises, Anne rented a small apartment. Alvarez cited John's death as grounds to seize her purse. When the trust stopped paying her bills, Anne began to be helped by friends and family. She now lived on a meager allowance that barely covered living expenses, medical care, and rent for the apartment. She also began dating an American named Greg Fisher, a former bodybuilder. The trial, conducted in Spanish, began on January 14, 2013 in the courthouse in downtown San Isidro. The prosecution of Anne was spearheaded by the enigmatic, middle-aged district attorney Luis Oces. Taciturn and secretive, with a prominent forehead and closely set eyes, Oces had suspected her from the very beginning. An entourage arrived for Anne in an armored van from San Jose, consisting of her relatives, her brother Ken and their grandmother Anne Asworthy, 2 of her closest friends, her overweight American boyfriend Greg Fisher, and 2 of John's friends. John's parents, who could not attend, sent statements for support for Anne to the court. Using a cane for support, Anne descended the steps into a courtroom the size of a high school chemistry lab. Costa Rica had replaced the jury system with judicial tribunals consisting of a presiding judge and 2 associates. Verdicts do not need to be unanimous. A majority rules. Presiding over Anne's trial was Jose Luis Delgado, a squirrel-jawed man who commanded with a casual authority. During the 6-day trial, the other 2 judges scarcely spoke, highlighting the allegory of class inequality. On one side sat Fabio Occhintrillo, impeccably dressed in an Italian cut suit. Next to him sat his assistant, carrying a zebra print handbag and the latest model mobile phone. Before them lay a stack of neatly encrypted and color-coded case files. You don't kill your husband just because you fell unwell today, Accusations argued. There is no motive, and without motive, there is no murder. Across from the defense sat Louis Oasis, a civil servant dressed like a fast food worker in work pants and a cheap shirt. Oasis worked alone. On his table lay a single tattered case folder he carried in an old briefcase. As Accusations addressed the court, Oasis leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at some point of interest. Defendants in criminal cases in Costa Rica are indeed allowed to testify in court during trial, and Anne spent over an hour describing the life and death of her husband. She even recounted a situation that illustrated the depth of her husband's self-destruction. 2 months before his death, Anne said she had prevented his suicide attempt. He had wanted to jump down the elevator shaft in their home. This revelation came as news. When asked about the reasons behind her husband's desire to do this, Anne replied, "He told me that he was a bad person, that he had failed to cure me. He said he was tired of dragging on this existence with everything he had to deal with. And he also told me that he was afraid of hurting someone, and that he was sure it would be safer for me without him." And said that in the month she had been seeing the doctor, John had emailed her expressing despair over everything from her minor ailments to his more serious mental state. The email ended with the words, "I want to kill everyone and then myself. I deserve death." It is unclear whether the police found such an email in their correspondence, but Anne said John even held a kind of rehearsal for suicide, lining up piles of all the pills he had, muttering, "What if I took them all?" On that fateful night from January 7 to 8, 2010, after the usual sunset watching, the Benders played Fallout 3. John played that video game like a man possessed for 2 or 3 hours at a time. Then they went upstairs to the 4th floor bedroom. John had a ritual associated with his OCD. He needed to arrange the pillows in a certain way. They got into bed. Anne claimed that when she tried to grab the gun from her husband's hands, it fell, and since it was loaded and the hammer cocked, it somehow fired. The frightened woman jumped up, turned on the light, ran to the bed on John's side, saw blood dripping onto the floor, and grabbed the walkie-talkie to call for help. At that moment, she already knew that John was dead because she had heard the death rattle his last breath. When Anne was later asked if she had touched the pillow, shell, or anything else, she answered, "I don't remember anything." Oasis studied the autopsy and police reports that questioned Anne's story. The pathologist's conclusion from the very beginning was quite definite: murder. Blood sample analysis showed that the crime scene was staged after death. According to the autopsy results, the victim was asleep when shot, and both the murder weapon and the spent shell were found in compromising locations. Shooting a gun almost always leaves traces on the shooter's hand. Analysis of John's hands showed no sign of any gunpowder residue, but Anne's hands did show such traces. The bullet entered just below the right ear and exited over the left eye. Why would a person committing suicide somehow manage to shoot himself in the back of the head? The prosecutor weighed in on this. Moreover, it's even more suspicious because John was left-handed, yet the entrance wound was on the right side of the brain cortex and slapped to his right. It's not hard to connect the dots. The pillow with the bullet hole found next to the body was likely placed on the head of the sleeping person, and the gun was fired, and mentioned his last words. However, John's earplugs, which he always wore at night, were still in place. It's not very convenient to talk to your wife when you can't hear anything. In the indictment, no motive theory was offered, but in Costa Rica, as in the US, prosecutors are not required to establish one. Nevertheless, the lack of a motive usually reduces the likelihood of a guilty verdict. The prosecution chose the classic firm no motive. The lady wanted to get her hands on the jewels. The morning after John's death, investigators discovered more than 3,000 precious gems in the house, diamonds, rubies, opals, worth around $20 million. Some were neatly arranged in custom-made display cases, others were randomly scattered on shelves or in boxes. Most of them had been brought into the country illegally, with no receipts or duties paid. Investigators did not even consider this as private jewelry collections. It looked more like a smuggling operation. The bubble on Wall Street burst in 2008. Faced with liquidity problems, the Benders probably got into a high-profit business. Then, according to the prosecution, the fatal woman killed her poor fool of a husband to escape the loot. However, when the police discovered John's body, she made no attempt to gather the stones or hide them. While the tribunal decided whose version was more truthful, Anne's or the prosecutor's, she and her defense team decided to relax after the long day in court. Anne put on a shiny green dress and had dinner at an outdoor restaurant specializing in chimichurri and sushi. The mood was restrained, euphoric, thanks to the feeling that the prosecution's case was weak. Her lawyer, Retrials, was dressed in an expensive pink polo shirt and tight jeans. The assistant lawyer, now dressed for an evening out, politely noted as he reassured Anne about Judge Delgado. "I know how he works," Retrials told his client. "If he was skeptical of your testimony, he would have asked you 50 questions." Relieved, Anne seemed dizzy. She hoped to be acquitted and start over. While the trial was underway, the defense gathered evidence of Bender's self-destruction. Testifying as a witness, his friend Pete Dalisi mentioned 3 different occasions when John admitted to suicidal tendencies, usually triggered by his inability to cope with his disappointment or failure. "Both his family and mine knew about his condition," Dalisi said, "and we understood it was just a matter of time before that moment came." On the last day of testimony, prosecutor Luis Auces began by calling 2 experts. The first was Luis Aguilar, an investigator with Costa Rica's main federal forensic unit. Auces and the impassive giant Aguilar stoked the fire by analyzing a series of gruesome death scene photos. The photos were projected onto a large screen and couldn't watch. One of John's friends nearly fainted. There, on the left side of the bed, surrounded by Tiffany lamps, lay the naked, bloodied body of John Bender. His head was titled on the left, and the fatal wound was located on the right side of the back of his head. His left wrist dangled off the left side of the bed, and under his hand flowed a river of blood, spilling over the edge of the mattress. Next to the pool of blood on the floor was John's gun, a sight that seemed incongruous given the location of the wound. Those present also observed a photo of the spent shell casing behind the bed, closer to Anne than to John. Next was Dr. Gretchen Flores, the state pathologist who examined the body after the shooting. Like Aguilar, she claimed that the blood traces on and around John's body were inconsistent with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The position of John's body also raised doubts. Based on the photos, his right arm lay along his body. Logically, John's arm should have dropped into a similar position at the moment the bullet entered his brain, suggesting an improbable scenario for a self-inflicted wound. Dr. Flores argued that anatomically, shooting in that position would be very difficult. The expert aimed to demonstrate that John could have not inflicted the fatal shot with the left hand. While her arguments were compelling, Anne had repeatedly explained that during the struggle for the gun, she had pulled John's hands to the right side of his head, causing the gun to fire. In response, Oquentrilo asked the doctor if she had considered this scenario in her conclusions. "That would require further study," Flores replied, "because it's a completely different situation. And the biggest mystery lies in the blood traces. While the gunshot explains the blood on the side of the wound, the presence of blood on the other side on the bed raises perplexing questions. According to the prosecution, the body must have moved for blood to pool on both sides. Suppose the shot was fired while John was sleeping face down, blood got on the side of the bed. Then the body was flipped face up in the position it was found. Blood ended up in the opposite side as well. However, the defense argues that the blood pattern analysis supports the hypothesis that there was indeed a scuffle between Anne and John. This resulted in the gun accidentally firing, blood spattering on one side of the bed, and when Anne released her husband, he fell into the bed in a different position. During his 2-hour closing argument, Osis paced back and forth, staring straight at Anne and commenting on her composure. "She had presence of mind to turn on the light," he said. "She was also able to unlock the elevator mechanism. She was also able to go downstairs, turn on the computer, and start sending emails." Anne was the only one who tested positive for gunshot residue. "The version of events given by Miss Anne is false," the prosecutor concluded. "It was she who fired the gun, and the elements at the crime scene prove that John Felix Bender did not shoot himself. Given that she took the life of her husband in a way that the criminal code defines as aggravated, we ask for 25 years in prison." Oquentrilo attempted to refute many of the prosecutor's claims. There was ample evidence that both the crime scene and the body had been disturbed during the chaos after Bender's death. The crime scene photos, it turned out, were taken several hours after investigators first discovered John's body. And of course, gunshot residue was found on Anne's clothing. She was right next to John when the shot rang out. The final words came from Anne, who struggled to maintain her composure, blinking frequently as she addressed the tribunal. "I am innocent," she said firmly. "I did not kill John." Judge Delgado announced that the tribunal would wait until Monday to deliver its verdict. On Monday, Anne's team gathered again outside the courtroom, only to find out that the judges need a few more hours. In court, Anne trembled as the cameras focused on her face. The court's verdict was. The judge also remarked, "The tribunal did not find the defendant's criminal liability irrefutable. We consider it possible that the defendant could have killed her husband, but it is also possible that it could have been suicide." Not being sure, the tribunal concluded that the evidence was not compelling in the form presented by the district attorney. If this last remark worried Anne, she didn't show it. She was too busy hugging her team, dodging reporters, looking for a cigarette, and getting out of San Isidro. Anne seemed to be heading for a better life, perhaps in Florida. However, soon there was news that the jewelry smuggling case had entered an active phase. Additionally, on February 12, a Costa Rican TV news channel reported that the prosecution was investigating whether a past business deal between her lawyer and one of the judges who acquitted her influenced the trial. It turned out that in 2003, Oquentrilo had sold a plot of land to none other than Judge Delgado. In response to journalists' questions, Oquentrilo said the decade-old deal in no way implied the close friendship prohibited by law. "Did you know that in Costa Rica a person can be tried multiple times for the same crime regardless of whether they were found guilty or acquitted in previous trials? I wonder if Anne knew about this when she got caught in this trap." In May 2014, she was shocked to learn that the Costa Rican government had decided to prosecute her for the murder of her husband for the second time. The judges were different, but the prosecutors repeated their position, arguing that the body evidence, shell casing, entrance hole, blood spatter, and chat pillow proved it was murder. Defense attorney Fabio Occhentrillo also insisted it was suicide, facing a possible 25-year prison sentence, and made a statement in court still claiming that John wanted to die himself. But even after 4 years and 2 trials, she was not ready for the verdict. Guilty. Anne's friends and family sat stunned in the courtroom. On May 28, 2014, she was sentenced to 22 years in prison and taken to Albuin Pastor Women's Prison. Anne's boyfriend Greg Fisher was devastated. Immediately after being sentenced, Anne Bender appealed her conviction, surrendering to the prospect of spending 22 years in Costa Rican prison would be strange. About 50 women in one section, 3 toilets for all, and no hot water. While Anne was incarcerated, tragedy struck. On November 16, 2014, 40-year-old Gregory David Fisher, with whom she had a romantic relationship, was found dead in his bed, with his puppy grieving beside him. Authorities found no signs of foul play in Fisher's untimely death, suspecting it to be either a heart attack or asthma attack. In the winter of 2015, after 9 months in prison, an event almost as shocking as the verdict happened, Anne Patton Bender won her appeal. The court overturned the conviction. After 3 trials and nearly 10 years, Anne was acquitted again for lack of evidence. She immediately left Costa Rica and returned to the US. But in this story, bad news always seems to follow good. Anne would soon learn she was not off the hook. The prosecution decided to try her a 4th time. A new trial was scheduled for June 2017 to take place before a new panel of 3 judges. However, it is unlikely that the US would extradite Anne Patton Bender to Costa Rica, or that she would return voluntarily. The handling of evidence in this case was so unprofessional that it is now practically impossible to determine that really happened. The crime scene was in complete chaos and little effort was made to preserve evidence. Forensic experts familiar with his case have described the investigations into John Bender's death as a forensic fiasco. It seems the police had no idea how to conduct an investigation and were unfamiliar with evidence-gathering procedures. And that's not even taking into account the corruption within the system. The possibility of bribery could have influenced both Anne's prosecution and acquittal. Perhaps the judges were indeed bought off by Alvarez, who disappeared with John's money. Will there be yet another trial against Anne Patton Bender? Personally, I have lost interest. After all, Albert Einstein once said, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." Anne herself has never pleaded guilty at any of the trials. Whether Anne is guilty or not, she has suffered regardless. Her passport was confiscated and she is listed on websites as internationally wanted. All the art and furniture that belonged to her and John rotted in the basements of the police department. Of the $12 million worth of gems, and managed to retrieve stones worth $4 million, paying $1.3 million in duties to take them out of Costa Rica. The 500 Tiffany lamps that illuminated this sad story were first confiscated, then smashed or lost. Now 52, Anne has obviously left this period of her life behind. She lost Boracay, and the Bender's devalued estate is now on sale for half the original price. For foreigners, purchasing real estate in Costa Rica has always been risky, and Boracay remains covered with the Shakespearean stain of John Bender's death and the drama of murder, madness, money, and Tiffany lamps. Today, the Bender's paradise is an abandoned, jungle, overgrown complex that is gradually deteriorating under the onslaught of the relentless elements. According to Anne, she still suffers from various physical ailments, including Lyme disease and a potentially fatal thrombus located right above the heart. During the trial preparation period, Under the pretext of emergency treatment, they unsuccessfully attempted to travel to the US. In 2014, when journalists brought Anne to Boracay for an interview, she had only one sign of poor health: a cane to lean on when walking. This cane contrasted strangely with her elegant, high-heeled "I will never regain what was taken from me. I will never have my husband back," she told the journalist, surveying the empty house. "But now it is time to reclaim what can be returned and live again." Alas, John Bender will have no second chance to start over. He lived his life haunted by the specter of death. Threats of retaliation from disgruntled neighbors, kidnapping attempts by former business partners, regular encounters with deadly jungle animals, and powerful enemies he rarely spoke of. But I somehow feel that this spectre caught up with him in the guise of the one from whom John least expected betrayal. Anne and John planned to create their paradise not only to get away from people but also to find happiness in it, and if not a cure, at least relief from their mental and emotional problems. However, it was this very pursuit that brought them so much stress. John and Anne slipped into a state of shared psychosis and lost touch with reality. At some point, one person's delusion fueled the other's and vice versa, a kind of reverse osmosis of madness. They deprived themselves of the chance to receive proper treatment or help from loved ones. According to the Bender's butler, Oswaldo Rogers, after John's death, he was cremated, and the urn containing his ashes remained in Boracay for many months. However, after all the staff were fired and the mansion's contents passed into the possession of the Costa Rican police, the urn was lost. What became of John Bender's remains is unknown. Perhaps his spirit has still not been able to move on the next dimension, and, tormented by melancholy and guilt, he wanders his lost paradise. The story of the death of American multimillionaire John Felix Bender in 2010 in the jungles of Costa Rica remains an unsolved mystery to this day. So, what do you think, young detectives? Is Anne Bender guilty of murdering her husband, or did he die due to a tragic accident?